the youngster of today is having one of the hardest times in their lives. Inflation is at double digit, touching 70%. Interest rates are soaring at 30%. And of course, we are yet believing and we are studying for the master's program. What is your honest advice to us as MBA students yet aspiring to make a life in Sri Lanka?
Right. So again, what I said at the beginning, I mean, I'm not saying that we all know that everything is not fine in Sri Lanka, but we also know that even if one does travel, go abroad, you migrate. Also, it is not as if everything is rosy. There will always be challenges. So whatever path you choose, I mean, we know that some people of our country will choose to migrate to live, to build up their lives overseas. But if you do choose to remain in Sri Lanka, I think we have to be firstly not to lose hope, not to think that Sri Lanka is bad. But I always say Sri Lanka is not North Korea. So Sri Lanka still offers hope. But if Sri Lanka is to succeed, I think we all must play a role, not just to wait for election time. I often see people saying we don't want to get involved. If you don't want to get involved, then you will not have the Sri Lanka will not reset. If Sri Lanka is to reset, its citizens, its people have to be concerned, have to get involved, have to take up the fight. And I think that is very important. So if you do choose to remain in Sri Lanka, my message would be, 1, do not lose hope. 2, understand that these times will pass.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome on behalf of MBA Diaries, hosted by Asia Pacific Institute of Information Technology, known as APIT Sri Lanka. And we are meeting constantly for the last few months, almost a year, meeting different people and different experienced mentors, at the same time gurus in different fields. And indeed, today is going to also be a very interesting session, I am sure. And let me warmly welcome all of you who are in the platform today on behalf of APIT Sri Lanka and on behalf of the Directorate. Warm welcome to all the students who are joining us and all our counterpart members who are joining us from different universities, and of course our distinguished guests and the foreign delegates who are joining us from different parts of the world. So having said that, let me warmly invite the epicenter of networking that we call and the pioneering personality behind bringing this experience to our students, Dr. Rohan Thattakorala, who is one of the directors at APIT Sri Lanka and at the same time the leadership behind postgraduate and undergraduate computing schools, giving all the guidance and knowledge that is necessary for the students to continue with their studies. So with that, let me hand over to Dr. Rohantha to start over the sessions for the day.
Thank you very much, Kaushali. Thank you very much. Appreciate sincerely for the introduction. And on behalf of the chairman of APIT, Mr. Bandhu Legodage, who's also the vice president for Nestle, and of course, our Chief Executive Officer, Prashant Nigodage. May I introduce our very distinguished speaker today. He's the president of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka. In 2017, he was appointed as a President's Council. He heads the law chambers practicing in the areas of criminal law, public law, constitutional law, and fundamental rights. He was from 2018 to 2020 the first chairman of the Office on the Missing Persons, an institution established as part of Sri Lanka's reconciliation mechanism. Prior to 2018, he was a member of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. The BSL played a key role in intervening to protect human rights during the Sri Lanka's crisis, stressing the importance of respecting the freedom to dissent and peaceful protests. Recently, the Hindu India described the BSL as being a voice of reason during Sri Lanka's crisis, describing his leadership as follows. Under his leadership since 2001, the BSL's public profile has drawn attention for being resolute, devoid of ambiguity and political rhetoric. Its statement speaks to immediate and specific concerns, basing itself on constitutional freedom, national laws, and leading judgments. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very eminent person, a person who was actually the head prefect at St. Joseph's College. His name, Saliya Pieris, President Bar Association of Sri Lanka. And today he will share a few thoughts about his stake in Sri Lanka, but it will be his own personal views and not the views of the organization that is attached to. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rohantha, and thank you to EPIT for this opportunity to share some thoughts, to share with you my thoughts on what have been the topic I've been asked is my take on Sri Lanka. So for about 15-20 minutes, I'll just share with you what I think is what I think about Sri Lanka, my take on Sri Lanka. Then we will open it for questions. So we all know that we are living in a time of perhaps one of the most stressful times in our country, and for most of those who may be watching this, I believe are people who are young people in their 20s or 30s, and who are perhaps are facing an unprecedented challenge. So one thing which I want to share is I think this is a time that Sri Lanka, we have to not lose hope, and that as a people, it is very important that we keep hope, we don't lose hope, and we to understand that Sri Lanka is a resilient nation. So why I say this is, when I entered, when I finished school, when we finished our A-levels in 1987, Sri Lanka had a similar situation, not economically, but there was an uprising in the south. There was the LTT uprising in the north. 1987 was a particularly difficult year. I remember once when I was in Peta, I was in a shop in Peta when we heard a loud explosion. That was a Peta bomb, and there was then we could see people being taken away in vehicles to hospital. Then 87, there were 86, 87 was a very difficult time. Then there was the Indo-Lanka Accord. There were riots after that. There was burning of buildings. Then came after 87, then came the JVP uprising against the Indo-Lanka Accord. You had the Indian peacekeeping forces in the north, and by the time we entered law college in 1989, all the other higher educational institutions were closed. Only, I think, the only higher education institution which continued to function was Sri Lanka Law College, but others were closed, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So when we look back, I think where I am concerned, about a third of my classmates have gone abroad, have settled down abroad. So it was a similar time of uncertainty. But we know that despite that uncertainty, Sri Lanka has been resilient. We have not gone on the path of, I always think things could have been worse. Sri Lanka could have never turned out to be like Somalia, for instance. Despite challenges, we have still managed. So I think one of the key during these difficult times is to understand that tough times are there, but that tough times are likely to pass. But when we look at these challenges, the challenges of this time, both as a country and as individuals, we look to these challenges as opportunities to reset our lives. And for the country, I think this is an opportunity to reset the country. We do not always see Sri Lanka, we do not always see people seeing this as an opportunity, but I think this serves as an opportunity to reset, to improve. And so although there are threats, although there are challenges, let us let us see how we can change these into opportunities. So there is similar time such as this was, they say, during the Great Depression in the United States in the late 20s and the early 30s. They say hundreds of thousands of people, or maybe millions, went out of job. People lost their houses, their employment. It was a time of much desperation. And they say that during this time, the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, used to address the nation. He used to speak to the nation by radio and weekly, and those were called fireside chats. And he would try to keep up the spirits of the people, to inspire people. So I think that is one lesson for Sri Lanka, not to lose hope, but to see how we can make the best of what has come about. Now, what is wrong with Sri Lanka? My take on Sri Lanka is that for far too long, we Sri Lankans have been looking at saviors to save this nation. Every election, there is a figure who comes, and then people are inspired by that figure and people vote for that person. But then that person has turned out to be disappointing. In my thinking, what Sri Lanka ought to do is, rather than looking at individuals, we must look at strengthening the institutions of our nation. My belief is, it is only by strengthening the institutions in our country that we can revive Sri Lanka. Now, if you look at the current crisis, I am one of those who believe that this is not only an economic crisis. We see politicians sometimes saying this is an economic crisis. And then today also we saw a leading politician referring to external forces as having caused Sri Lanka's economic crisis. So that we know is utter rubbish. The Sri Lanka's economic crisis is caused, or has been caused, by a failure of our institutions, by a failure of governance. Now, why has governance failed in Sri Lanka? Governance has failed because we have spent less time in trying to strengthen these institutions. There is a book called Why Nations Fail, and the writers outline that nations fail because of poor governance, because of the failure of leaders to address issues, because leaders look to their parochial, partial interests, their narrow interests, rather than the wider interests of the country. So my take on the country is that we must have a culture where we build institutions. Now, why do I say that Sri Lanka's institutions have become weak? If you look at, I'm sure all of you are aware of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, but long before the 20th Amendment, from perhaps the 1970s, we have gone on we have spiraled downwards, at least in terms of governance and controls. So, for instance, the area which I am familiar is the legal system, but not only the legal system, other areas also, whether it is whether it be the public service, the police service. We know that how these institutions over the years, the police, the public service, have got politicized. We know recently, you would have heard how the Inspector General of Police is heard to say that there were that 82 or 182 out of 184 officers in charge of police stations were political appointees. Now, that is a matter of absolute shame. If the Inspector General of Police says his force is politicized, that is a matter of shame. But why has that happened? Because we have allowed political interference. We have not allowed the people at the helm of our public service, at the helm of the police service, independence. We have not allowed them to be strong. We have not given them the legal framework which is necessary to resist interference into their independence. Now, I contrast this with a country such as the United States. Now, you know that the US under Trump, we know that after the election of Joe Biden, how Trump tried to overturn that election. He tried to prevail on the courts in that country to overturn elections. He prevailed on his own partymen who were state officials who were conducting elections in the various parts of the United States. He tried to tell them to overturn elections. Ultimately, he tried to persuade his own vice president to refuse to accept the results of the elections. But we know that whether it was the Supreme Court of the United States, remember, the Supreme Court of the United States had 3 Trump appointees. But whether it was the United States Supreme Court or whether his own vice president or the officials in the various states, he tried to prevail on them, but couldn't, because they respected the institutions and they respected democracy. Ultimately, the applications he made to the American Supreme Court were thrown out unanimously by the judges. Now, this is because in that country, over time, they have built, strengthened institutions. Now, why do I say Sri Lankan institutions have not been, are not strong? So we know that there is a lot of room in Sri Lanka for various institutions to be politicized. We find political interference. As a result of political interference, we find institutions lack independence, lack impartiality. Sometimes they fail to be accountable. They fail to be accountable to the people. So if you take the central bank, the central bank is one example. Central bank is one example. We know an institution which has to be independent. How in 2 to 3 years, or even maybe a little longer, maybe longer, political appointments have ruined the independence of the central bank. And what happened? When it came to the crunch, when it came to the economic crisis, you found that the central bank was not telling the public the truth as to what was happening. Now, even now we see attempts to attack the independence of the central bank. Recently, we heard a particular politician. He was saying the central bank must carry out government policy. Now, that is not, the central bank needs to be independent, not to just carry out government policy. But so that is the state. That is why I say that we have to strengthen institutions. Sri Lanka, there are many examples of interference, but I would like to outline, so for example, how has the executive over the years interfered with the independence of the judiciary in Sri Lanka. Now, the President Jayawardena appointed a Chief Justice, Neville Samarakot, who was in fact a lawyer who was close to him, a very senior lawyer of the private bar. Mr. Jayawardena appointed him directly as Chief Justice. Now, Neville Samarakot turned out to be one of the finest Chief Justices of this country. He was a strong Indian person. He maintained his independence. Then at a particular point, President Jayawardena tried to oust him from office, tried to have him impeached from office. Luckily, that did not succeed. But over time, there have been the president's powers over appointments, not only to the judiciary, but to other key officers have been questioned. Because from 1970, the Constitution gave the president an unchecked power over certain things, such as appointments of judges, appointment of key officials, etc. So that is what was changed with the 17th Amendment of the Constitution, when the Parliament itself agreed that there should be a check and balance on the president's powers of appointment. So there came a Constitutional Council which operated as some sort of a balance on the president's powers of appointment. But that Constitutional Council, that 17th Amendment was short-lived. It was undermined. It was undermined by the politicians. It ultimately failed. Then the 18th Amendment again gave the president absolute power. Then the 19th Amendment again tried to restore what was there in the 17th, trying to bring in a Constitutional Council. Then 5 years later, again, we reversed the 19th Amendment and brought in the 20th Amendment. Now we have the 21st Amendment. We have to hopefully wait and see how it will work out. But in all these, I think what Sri Lanka lacks is to ensure is a mechanism to build institutions. So we as citizens, we have to call for the establishment of institutions which are independent. So whether it be the police, whether it be the public service or judiciary, those institutions must be independent. But I don't stop at independence alone. We must also make these institutions efficient and accountable. Now, one of the sad parts of many of our government institutions are they don't run to optimum efficiency. So we need to have them independent, but we also need to look at ways and means of how these institutions can be made accountable, how those who lead institutions should be able to account for the efficiency of their institutions. Now, there are many ways in which it can be done, but among the many ways is also, I think, we need to cut through a lot of red tape which exists in our country. So the one example is, I think if we do cut red tape, if we go into greater use of technology, I believe that we can make our system more efficient. So that is one of my takes on Sri Lanka, that is to have institutions which are independent, to strengthen the institutions, don't look for saviors, or you might want to call them saviors or the Kumara or whatever, but don't look for such saviors, but look towards strengthening institutions. And that is what each and every one of us can do to contribute to the system. Secondly, I want to say that another point of my take on Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka must be a country which respects the rights of individuals, not only the rights of each and every individual, but the rights of the weaker sections of society. There was an American who said that a nation reveals itself by how it treats the most feeblest members of its community. So the way we respect the rights of the weaker segments of our community are very important. So this is why in the institution which I lead at present, the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, we took a lead role in trying to protect the rights, the fundamental rights of people. Now, what are these fundamental rights? These are the rights which are given to us by the Constitution. These are the rights which is said is part of our sovereignty. You know, in Sri Lanka, according to our Constitution, it is we who are sovereign, the people who are sovereign. So our rights, the rights which we have enshrined by the Constitution, those are the fundamental rights. Now, what are these rights? These are freedom from torture, the right of equality, the freedom of thought, the right not to be discriminated on various grounds such as race, religion, sex, caste, etc., political belief, so on. Then we have the rights relating to the security and liberty of the individuals, the freedom from arbitrary arrest, the freedom from arbitrary detention, the right of a fair trial, the right to have a fair trial. Then in our criminal law, we have the presumption of innocence, the right not to be punished arbitrarily. These are some of the rights. Then we have another set of rights called the individual freedoms, like the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of culture, and all those rights are there. Now, these rights need to be respected. And we have to have a culture in Sri Lanka where people respect the rights of the others. Now, to give you just one example, some of you may have heard or would have seen on media during the past few maybe years. Suddenly, you see the police announcing that a suspect in custody has been taken to show weapons which he was hiding, and suddenly he died in a shootout. Now, most of these cases have hallmarks of extrajudicial killings, that is, execution outside the legal process. Now, you find some people approving this. Some people saying, a person from the underworld, why shouldn't he be killed? But the problem is, if we leave it to the police officers, to some SI or inspector or a superintendent of police to decide on whether a man lives or not, that means our system is not working. So we need to build, have a country where rights are respected, where rights and freedoms are respected. Of course, rights and freedoms also have certain limits. Now, you know that there is a saying that your rights end where my nose begins. What it means is, if you're exercising your rights, if you adversely, wrongly affect me, that is not correct. So we exercise our fundamental rights only as long as we respect the rights of other people also. So there are limitations to fundamental rights. So even for freedom of expression, there are limitations. We can't, for example, defame people. Now we know on social media sometimes people defame others, but we cannot defame others because there is a limit on our rights, because our rights cannot go beyond what is legally permissible. But subject to that, we must build a country where people's fundamental rights are respected. Now we know that if today sometimes people approve assault by the police. If a thief is caught, if a man is caught, we think nothing if the police assault that person. But that is a violation of his right to be free from torture. Sometimes we fail to respect the beliefs of others. We think only our belief is correct, and we fail to respect the right of another to believe his or her own religion. So I think we must instill in our country the freedom, the respect for fundamental rights. Thirdly, I will finish with this. Thirdly, I think we need to have a country where people are not frightened. People are not frightened to take up, to confront what is wrong. Very often we see that all of us sometimes, for our own interests, we try not to, we do not want to criticize. We do not want to maybe point out when something wrong is happening. We tend to turn a blind eye. We tend to keep quiet and say, well, I fear, I don't want to criticize because I fear that I will come to harm. The Burmese leader, the imprisoned Burmese leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, says that one of the greatest gifts which a nation can have is that of abaya. She says, that is really the freedom from fear. She said, not just bodily courage, but the courage, the freedom to be fearless in one's own mind. So this is, I think, very important for the citizens of this country. So that is why we saw in the last few months, when we saw hundreds or thousands of young people coming onto the streets and speaking up for their rights. I think that was something to be admired. As someone said, for the first time, we moved away. I think it is Professor Uyangodu who says we moved away from being just voters to being citizens of this country. So as citizens, we need to be concerned about what is happening to this country. We have to call out corruption. We have to fight to strengthen mechanisms which will help this country. So if we want this country to be a country for the well-being of ourselves and our children, we must be willing to make that sacrifice and to speak out and to say when something is wrong, to say that it is wrong, right? And very often we know that it is the younger people whose mindset, who would be in a better position to point out the errors of the powers that be. And I think that is very important. So 3 things which I want to highlight: strengthen the institutions in this country. So, don't look for saviors, but rather let us look to strengthen the institutions of our country. Secondly, the protection, we must have a country which respects fundamental rights of people, the different rights which people of this country have by virtue of the Constitution. and a country where people respect the rights of others. And thirdly, a community which is not frightened, which cannot be cowed down, which is willing to stand up and call out what is wrong. So these are the brief observations which I want to share with you on what I think Sri Lanka should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saliya. I really love listening to you, and the point that you mentioned, don't fear to tell what is wrong, is so apt, because we try to go with the wind of what the way that the world needs to perceive us, and we sometimes don't want to stand out, but I think that's what our schools have taught us. Whole heap of questions are coming in. Let me take one by one. So he says, after being a head prefect at St. Joseph's, why did you join the legal profession? It's an MBA student who's working at Brandix.
Right. Actually, law was not my first ambition. I did bio. So, but then after when my A-level results came, I had the option of either my results are not sufficient to enter, certainly not to enter medical college, and in North Colombo Medical College or the private medical college was not all that affordable. So I had the option of either repeating my A-levels or choosing a different path. So at that time, Sri Lanka Law College was calling for applications, and so I decided to follow that path. And rather than repeating my A-levels, I entered Sri Lanka Law College. And at the time I entered Sri Lanka Law College, I thought to myself that I will also, over time, I will do a degree and a postgraduate degree. So that is what I did. So that is how I turned to do law. Of course, I think my first ambition was to do medicine, but I think I always had a liking for the law and study of the constitution and politics. So that I think also prompted me to do law.
A question from Priscilla, interesting question. She's saying the youngster of today is having one of the hardest times in their lives. Inflation is at double digit, touching 70%. Interest rates are soaring at 30%. And of course, we are yet believing and we are studying for the master's program. What is your honest advice to us as MBA students, yet aspiring to make a life in Sri Lanka?
Right. So again, what I said at the beginning, I mean, I'm not saying that we all know that everything is not fine in Sri Lanka, but we also know that even if one does travel, go abroad, you migrate, also it is not as if everything is rosy. There will always be challenges. So whatever path you choose, I mean, we know that some people of our country will choose to migrate to live, to build up their lives overseas. But if you do choose to remain in Sri Lanka, I think we have to be firstly not to lose hope, not to think that Sri Lanka is bad. But I always say Sri Lanka is not North Korea. So Sri Lanka still offers hope. But if Sri Lanka is to succeed, I think we all must play a role, not just to wait for election time. I often see people saying we don't want to get involved. If you don't want to get involved, then you will not have the Sri Lanka will not reset. If Sri Lanka is to reset, its citizens, its people have to be concerned, have to get involved, have to take up the fight. And I think that is very important. So if you do choose to remain in Sri Lanka, my message would be, 1, do not lose hope. 2, understand that these times will pass. the previous, from our personal experience, the 87 to 89 period was a tough, very tough period in our country. Just the chit establishments would close, there would be strikes, everything would go off. I remember in one instance, a transformer was exploded at somewhere. I lived in Mount Lavinia. Transformer exploded, and we didn't have power for 3 days. So we need to not to lose hope, but have courage, also persevere. And of course, you need to perhaps also be strategic. So when it comes to things like financial planning, you need to think. We know that it is tough. We know that young people whose salaries are limited and probably who will now get hit by income tax, by the new tax regime, we'll find it tough. But well, I think to have hope that these times, that you can overcome these times.
Thank you, Saliya, and I think it's so apt. I love what you said. If you're staying in Sri Lanka, take the fight and learn to fight. That's exactly what I think Sri Lanka requires. And first time I have heard this. We've been interviewing people for the last maybe 2 years. We have had about 101 guests, Saliya, but I think your advice is so spot on. If you're going to stay in Sri Lanka, take the fight on, and you've got to fight what is right. A very interesting question coming from a law student, Tavisha. She's actually studying for the master's program. She's saying, what was the last book you read and why?
Well, it's the last book I have read is it is a Team of Rivals. A Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin. That's on the life of Abraham Lincoln.
And why is the question?
Right. Why is because when you look at the leadership traits of, I've been fascinated by the leadership traits of Abraham Lincoln and how he was able to bring rivals together. The Team of Rivals is about his cabinet, in fact, of how he would draw from rival views, rival opinions, and people who were perhaps rivals with each other, and how he got them into his cabinet to produce the cabinet during wartime, very effective, and to provide effective leadership. It is also said that about Lincoln that he was not petty, that he would be able to rise above personal differences in the wider interests of the country.
Thank you. Very, very interesting analogy you brought in, because the same thing happened where they say that the best games in business you can learn from war, and war and business is same. So there's an interesting question coming from a McLaren boy, Pial. He heads lubricants, and he's asking, do you believe in Sri Lanka?
Well, I do. I have what I mentioned earlier also, that I do believe in Sri Lanka. I think that Sri Lanka is a country which is worth fighting for, and I think Sri Lanka is a country still which is resilient and which is a country of hope. So many years ago, say maybe 25 years or maybe about 22 years ago, my family and we had the chance to go to Australia on a holiday, and it was very different. Different. It was when you travel to Singapore, and unlike young people now who may have traveled very much more. For me, the first time I traveled out of Sri Lanka was when I was about 27. But so when we visited Australia, that was something different, much more orderly, much so you tend to like that. So then when we thought about it, whether what are our options, then we did decide to remain in Sri Lanka. And I must say for myself, I have no regrets. So I believe in this country. I think this is a country of a lot of potential, but it's just that we have not been able to get things right. Once I met a American diplomat who said she has served in the East countries of East Africa, and she said those countries have half the resources which Sri Lanka has. And she said, I don't know why Sri Lanka has not achieved its full potential. But I think if for Sri Lanka to achieve its full potential, it is up to us as citizens of this country. So yes, I do believe in this country.
There's Harshini from Seat who's saying you can get an overseas job always, and I'm sure you can, you know, find a better, greener pastures. But you continue to fight for Sri Lanka, and that's what we saw in you, and we are proud to know you. But why?
So again, what I think it's I mean, for one moment, I don't, for anyone who does choose to say to live overseas and to to establish yourselves overseas, I don't see anything wrong in that. I have had close relations. I have had my aunts, uncles who chose to go out and to build their lives in another country. And so that, and it has been a struggle, but we see how they have achieved. So, but it's just a matter of choice. It's a matter of choice, and I see the positives in this country. I see that. I mean, I see the negatives also, but I feel that that this is where we have been born, and this is where we are. Personally, I'm comfortable in this country.
Very interesting question coming up. He says that yeah, he works in Doha. It's Trehan. He says some speculate that you are the Sri Lankan of the year for 2022, and I think I totally endorse that from the leadership you gave in tough times and how you actually shifted this pendulum when everybody was like, closing their door. What is your view of the leadership that you gave?
Well, I have to say that the leadership is whatever was done by the legal community was something which was collective, and the credit has to go to there were thousands of lawyers who rose to the occasion, and I'm happy to have been able to lead the legal community during this time to give leadership to the Bar Association. But I think the credit for this goes to thousands of members of the profession, and of course to others who are exercising their freedom of expression, the freedom to dissent. I think credit must go to all of them. So I am happy that I was in this place at this time, not something which I really envisaged at the point when I was elected to lead the Bar Association. This was not something which I anticipated. But when it did come, I thought that as the members of the legal profession, that it was our duty each part of our mandate of the Bar Association, that we have to protect the fundamental rights of the people of this country. And that is where we moved in. I just want to say that I want to give credit, and in this public way, to hundreds of junior members of our profession. I don't know how many of you saw on the 9th of May, when there was an attack on Golface, and there were hundreds of young lawyers who went to the scene, and you would have seen the human chain which was formed to separate between the protesters and the goons who were trying to attack them. So that was a really proud moment for our profession, and I think I'm happy that I had the opportunity to give leadership to the legal profession during this time.
Thanks, Saliya. Charit is asking you, Isn't the world in chaos? And what do you think? Um, what is your view?
Yeah, I think the world is, to be honest, I think it is more frightening than what it was 10 years ago. And especially when you see what is happening in Ukraine, even just talk of nuclear weapons being used, terrorism, and so on. But then again, this is also a time when there is a lot of interest, or shall we say, where people are very conscious of the environment, of rights of people, and maybe more than any time in the ever in the world, people are also, there is a lot of people fighting for the rights of others, fighting for unity, fighting for the protection of the environment. So I think it is a frightening time in the world, but it also could be a time of hope, and where hopefully we can get things right. I'm not saying that I'm optimistic about the environment and so on, because we really do not know, and whether those events will ultimately overtake all of us. But it is a very uncertain time in the world, and also I think one of the greatest concerns is how the voices of moderation are sometimes lost, because there are so many extreme views on every side, and those who are moderate sometimes fall between the two.
Saliya, there was, what we see some crazy times because, when somebody is alleged with corruption, uh, uh, someone puts a case against him and then subsequently is bailed out. And then, whenever that the case is to be taken, the dates keep shifting around, and sometimes for 5 years, 6 years, and I remember my great granddad, he was the second Chief Justice of Sri Lanka, Sir Edward Jayadilka, who once, he said the law is an ass. Uh, what do you think of this statement? I mean,
Yes, that's a quotation which is there around, but I think the law is very necessary to regulate the lives of people and of a country. And I know that sometimes people are not always happy with what is happening about the legal system, but at the same time, so when people find some very public figures being acquitted in cases, they're trying to find fault with the court or with the system. But also we have to understand that in our country, we have a fairly developed system of the law, like in other countries where every accused has a fair trial. So during a fair trial, a judge who gives a determination, a decision, a judgment, cannot look at other factors, but he has to look at the evidence before him. So if the evidence is weak, whether the man on the dock is good or bad, the judge will have to acquit him. Because that is the cases are tried on the strength of evidence. So what we read on social media and what we read in newspapers are different to the evidence presented before a judge at a trial in terms of the evidence ordinance. So if a judge can decide by reading the newspapers and social media, so many people will be convicted. But that is not how things work. Things work because trials are conducted on it, and that is the safeguards which are there for the benefit of the people. Because if those safeguards are not there, neither you nor I will be safe from an unfair trial, from a witch hunt. So that is why those safeguards are there. So the average citizen looking at it is not always happy. But the law is necessary, and the safeguards which are offered by the law are necessary in a civilized country.
Last question, Sadia. I thank you so much for dedicating almost an hour of your time. And the question is, will Sri Lanka ever see what happened in Singapore, where one or two people will be taken and booked for corruption?
Well, I suppose I do think that if we do have a good, effective anti-corruption regime, that is possible. But also we have to, we have to understand that Sri Lanka is different from Singapore. For those who say Sri Lanka should be like Singapore, Singapore also there are questions relating to the strict regime, related to rights of people, so on. So I don't think we need to copy Singapore. We should have our own unique identity. And certainly Singapore has many good things, but also the Singapore context may be different from Sri Lanka. Singapore is a relatively smaller city, but I think there are a lot of lessons which we can learn from Singapore. Among those is, of course, the fact that Singapore is a multi-ethnic country and where they respect the diversity of its people.
Thank you very much, Saliya Pieris, President by Association Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for your time. And I think you are so focused to giving very, very, very succinct answers. And I think my pick for today was, if you believe something is right, fight for what is right. And if you're going to stay in Sri Lanka, that's the kind of ethos you need to have. It's the single-minded message that I would take from you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate. Ruth, over to you.
Good evening, Mr. Saliya. Thank you so much for sparing some time from your busy schedule to address our audience today. Your thoughts and views that you have shared on the platform is truly valuable to anyone who is considering in making a life-changing decision. So with this, before we draw this session to a close, I'd like to remind our industry partners that at APIT, we have a well-defined internship program. So if you have any opportunities available at your company, to please consider us. With this, I'd like to thank the IT team at APIT for the technical support extended during this session. To all the audience, students, alumni, industry partners, and well-wishers here in Sri Lanka and across the world. Thank you for joining in today. Have a good day, a good afternoon, and a good evening. Take care till we meet again next week.